Hello and welcome back to another episode of Strong Collectors Comics. My name is Jordan and I am joined today by my fellow bearded co-host, Dakota. And today we are diving into our top 5 DC stories. I'm pretty excited about this. I did have a little bit of a difficult time narrowing it down. Admittedly, growing up, I was more of a Marvel person. I think I did have some older brothers that were into DC, kind of by way of a lot of the animated series, got into a lot of those. I don't know about you, Dakota, but that was kind of formative for my DC experience.
For sure. Especially Justice League and Justice League Unlimited. But now that I think about it, so was Teen Titans, same with like Batman and Superman animated series. I think although Marvel had some good stuff with X-Men, I think DC really had the better animated stuff. And I think that's still true today.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I was always drawn more to Marvel in many ways, but most of the cartoons I watched, like Batman animated series, Justice League Unlimited, Batman Beyond, those were all DC. So, but yeah, I think they've got a lot of cool stories to offer. A little bit of a caveat I noticed as I was going through Dakota. A lot of my favorite DC stories are Batman. I think that's kind of by nature of the character. I think everybody loves Batman. There's so much you can do with him. But I think I introduced a little bit of variety in my list. And we don't know what's on each other's list, so we'll just get into these and see where it leads us.
All right. I think I'll say I've got 4 out of my top 5 have Batman in them, but only one of them has Batman as like the lead. So,
all right.
If that makes you feel any better. You want me to go first? I'll get my number 5.
All right.
All right.
Number 5.
My number 5, and again, this is our list. We're not saying this is definitive because I'm sure most of my list is not on everybody's definitive. I've got some biases here, and my first bias is this is one of the first stories that I started getting kind of straight through, picking up each issue, and that is Blackest Knight, and I'm going to go into Brightest Day. So I thought this, like going back to watching the animated shows and stuff, I don't remember what it was, but there was like for some reason they had like a preview before the movie of this storyline. Like, I don't even think it was going to be like a show or anything. It was just like, coming up.
Like a promo for the comic.
Yeah, which I don't remember seeing that too often. Was like, this comic story is coming. And I was like, oh, that sounds kind of cool. I'll get into that. And I got in like right with issue 0 all the way through Brightest Day. And I thought it was pretty cool. It's kind of like DC's version of Marvel Zombies, because they're bringing back some of those characters that had died with the Black Lantern rings. I liked the idea of the different colored rings being fueled by different emotions. So yeah, I thought that was cool. I would love to get some Blackest Knight action figures to go with my display, but the McFarlane ones just don't really do it. And then the DC Direct, they did a lot more of them, but they're not superposable. So I feel like I'm still waiting on my perfect action figure to go with my top 5 comic book.
Yeah, no, that was a cool one. I remember, like I said, I wasn't reading tons of DC books, but that was one that I do remember reading. And it was pretty cool. I think the way they kind of introduced, sort of built on the lore of like the Green Lantern rings. I always think that's cool when a writer takes like what could be kind of a simple concept and then like expands it a little bit or develops it more, where you kind of get all the different affiliations and what they mean and seeing which characters were paired with what.
Because I think
if
I was going to throw in some honorable mentions, I was like, I don't know if this really even fits as an honorable mention, but I would go like outside of that story farther, like you're saying, because the lead up to Blackest Night where you had like the Red Lanterns and all that, and then post where it was kind of like all the like leaders of each colored lantern were trying to like, put everything back together. I thought that was like a cool era of Green Lantern. My favorite era of Green Lantern for sure.
That's fair. I think a lot of people would agree with you. And it's Jeff Johns, which everyone regards as he's had a lot of good Green Lantern stories, so I think he's usually the Green Lantern guy.
Nice.
Although I think he may have... Did they help him with the Green Lantern movie? I don't know. We won't talk about that if he did. I'm not sure. All right, my number 5 is going to be a Batman Superman comic, and this is the storyline called Absolute Power. I don't know if you remember this one or if you've heard me talk about it.
I don't think so.
But my brother had the single issues, and my brother used to do this thing where he'd get like number 10, 11, and then 14, 15, and then 19 and 20. So it'd be really frustrating because I didn't have my own comic money. But this is one that he had the whole run of, so I got to read the whole story. Basically, it's a Jeff Loeb. He was doing Batman Superman, like kind of relaunched it early 2000s. But basically, the premise is a lot of the Legion of superheroes, villains from the future, essentially go back in time, and because they can time travel, they kidnap Batman and Superman when they're kids, and essentially kind of raise them. So it's like what would have happened to these characters if they hadn't grown up in the environment they did. So it kind of feels a little bit like a Elseworld What If, but it's in the main continuity. But of course, they're like more the enforcers, and kind of it's like this totalitarian thing, and you have the like resistance heroes going up against them. But they do some cool stuff. Features a cameo from Uncle Sam, which I know you don't see Uncle Sam a lot, but I think he can be a fun character when he shows up. But this one was just really cool because it kind of introduced a lot of like different variants of what was going on, which is now becoming, real popular, the multiversal stuff.
Right.
But that one was really cool. And there's a character moment in there that I remember I was like, whoa, this is pretty heavy duty. As far as like a character death goes. And I was like, wow. And again, maybe at that point it hadn't sunk into me that comic book deaths don't usually mean a lot, but that one was significant for me. So I thought that one was pretty cool.
Nice. Yeah, I think I would say, if I'm going to give another runner-up, another comic series that I know you used to have as a kid, was the Batman Superman. I think it was Ed McGuinness was the artist.
Yeah. I think this was that same run.
Was it?
Yeah, the first of that series was Public Enemies, where remember like Lex Luthor's the president, and he like puts out a bounty or something on Batman and Superman. So yeah, this is later in that same line. So
nice. And then I would definitely like that story. I need to get farther into it, I guess, because I'm sure I'd borrowed that from you. So maybe you just didn't want to share your prized possession favorite story ever. Because as kids, some of our books did tend to go missing, which I'm sure we're going to get into later on in your list.
Right.
All right. My number 4 is kind of a weird one, but it's Robin. And this is from like 1991 to 1993. There was kind of like mini series of Robin. So the first one was, I think, 5 issues, and the second one was 4 issues, and then the third one was 6 issues, and it was kind of like him going up against different villains. I can't remember who the first one was, some karate guy with a big snake or dragon tattoo. The second one, which I liked a little bit more, was he was going up against Joker, and then the third one, which I think was the first one I actually read, was him teaming up with Huntress. But I think that's kind of one of my favorite art styles. I can't remember who the artist was, but it's that like Nightfall type of vibe.
Right.
And then Tim Drake is my favorite Robin because of these stories.
I feel like he got a lot more of those like solo Robin series and spin-offs at that time. Because I don't really remember a lot. I mean, obviously you have Dick Grayson becomes Nightwing and goes off, but I think as Robin, they did a lot more with Tim Drake. Yeah. Because I do think he was pretty popular, especially after everyone hated Jason Todd so much they killed him. Right. So they're like, we gotta craft this new Robin so people like him. Can't have that again.
And they did a decent job at it. So, and I would like to read some more where he kind of goes into his own, where he turns into like Red Robin and stuff like that. I don't think I've read anything with Red Robin in it, but I'd like to.
I like it. Okay, next one I am going to go with a mainly Batman tale, and this one is going to be Batman Hush. And this one I think is cool. Like another Jeff Loeb story, but I think he does a great job. But what I really liked about this story is it uses so many of the Batman rogues gallery. Like basically pretty much every prominent Batman character is featured in it. But it's done in a way that it's not like rushed or like they're crammed in there. Like I remember reading it being like, this is actually really well developed and like it makes sense for these characters to be there. But it also introduced a new Batman villain of Hush, and it had like a pretty good mystery to it. They kind of did some natural development with like the Catwoman relationship beyond the like will they won't they, like trying to actually go somewhere. And yeah, I don't know. This is just like my one. If people are wanting to, it has some other cool cameos too. But I think when people are wanting to get into Batman, I think this is a really cool Batman story that has a lot of those detective elements, the mystery, but also has that modern feel to it. So I'm still waiting for them to do some version. I don't know. I think you could do a lot with some of the concepts in that story and bring them into other adaptations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is the one I was expecting would be on your list, because I remember as kids you would let me borrow this one. But like you said, this is, if somebody asks like, hey, where should I start with comics, you usually would recommend this. You recommended it to the wrong person, and then they stole your book and you never got it back.
Well, they must have just loved it so much, Dakota, that they said, I want to share this with my friends. So I did manage to track down another copy, so don't worry. But yeah, that's one that I like quite a bit.
Yeah, I agree. And that is definitely, I think that one would probably fit in a lot of people's top fives. All right, getting into my number 3 now. I'm going to go with Flash from 2006. This is a 13-issue run. Give you a little bit of spoiler here if you haven't read it. This doesn't really spoil too well, maybe it does. Anyway, we're going to spoil it anyway. You start out, I think, issue 1, Bart Allen comes back to life. In issue 13, Bart Allen dies. So,
wow,
poor guy was only alive for 13 issues, but they were.
That's how it goes sometimes.
I liked him, and this one is definitely playing off some nostalgia. This is like one of the earlier comics I read and like actually read, because as like a little kid, I was just kind of reading at most the speech bubbles, and if there was too many speech bubbles, I would just skip them entirely. So this is kind of when I'm actually like starting to read and like understand more. But I thought the art is like my favorite Flash art, I think. And then I just thought it was cool to kind of get, because I was used to Wally West from the cartoon, but I thought it was kind of cool to get a different Flash in there. And then like it's similar to Hush, where you get a lot of the rogues. They kind of all team up, and in the end, Flash doesn't quite. I mean, he beats him because the hero wins, but at what cost? And that cost is his life.
That's a good lesson for a young boy to learn.
Yeah. I don't think you probably haven't read that one, have you?
I never really have read a whole lot of Flash stories, to be honest. Like, I think the Flash is cool. I've never quite been, like, intrigued by him, like, by himself. I think he works in a team dynamic.
Yeah.
Maybe for me, it's just kind of like the premise of super speed. Like,
yeah.
Like, obviously, I think he was created at a time where that was just kind of a gimmick, like, oh, he's super fast. But, like, I think writers have tried to do more. I just think, because then you get to that whole, like, Quicksilver in X-Men Days of Future Past, where it's like, if he really was doing what he can do all the time, nobody could stop him. So,
yeah.
But I guess you can get into that with a lot of things. So I'd still like to read a great Flash story. Maybe that's one I need to check out. Getting into my number 3 is a Superman tale. Dakota, we're taking this one back to the 80s. And this is called Superman, Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. And this is written by the legendary Alan Moore, one of my favorites. Probably the best to ever do it.
Oh,
I'm gonna put that out there right now.
Throwing it down like that.
But basically what this one did, and I think it's really cool, is like at a time, like it was definitely a shift in comic books, going from kind of a lot of these lighter tones to kind of becoming more grounded and dark. And that's kind of what this did, where it served as essentially like because they've been publishing like the Action Comics, and this was like a what if this was the last Superman, like we're gonna end it, like this is the end of Superman, and like it's like a 2-part story. So it obviously leans into that concept of finality with it. So it still has a lot of those like it's an interesting for me like historical piece of comics where it's really showing that transition for like mainstream characters to kind of be in these darker stories, because like part of it starts off and Bizarro shows up and he's just like murdering people left and right, and he's like, if I'm the opposite of you, like, and you save people, I should kill people. So it's like actually introduces like, oh, this is kind of heavy duty. So but it uses a lot of the Superman lore and characters, but kind of, and a lot of this was happening as they were doing the whole crisis thing, like establishing this was this other Earth where this ended, but then they could do another Earth. But yeah, I think there's some really interesting stuff there, despite its age. You may find some things you enjoy there, Dakota. But for me, almost anything by Alan Moore, I think, is worth reading, at least mainstream. Some of his other stuff can get a little out there, but this is a good one.
Okay, nice. Yeah, I have not read that one, but that does sound, I like the idea of kind of like writing the end of a story's or a character's story. Because kind of like when we interviewed Todd McFarlane on the regular Strong Collectors podcast, he was kind of saying how he wanted his character of Spawn to outlive him. Like he has the ending, but he hopes it never gets told.
Right.
I'm more of the camp of I want it to be told, and kind of like you said, like this is its own separate story. Superman's still alive and well, but we still get to know the end, and the journey to get there never maybe comes. But I like that concept.
Yeah, I think we've seen a lot of that since then, but for me, this was one of the like earliest examples, I think, to prominently do it as like the final Superman tale. You know, now you've had like kind of like the Marvel The Ends or a lot of the dystopian future, Old Man Logan, you know, whatever you want to do. But this to me seems like one of the early ones that was kind of introducing some of the like, this story isn't just going to go on forever. Like it has a clear stopping point, which I think is a cool thing to see in comic books, because usually, like you said, it just goes on indefinitely. So
yeah,
I like that one.
All right. I like it. My number 2, this one is like a timeless book to me. Like every time I read it, it's just as good as the first time. And that is New Frontier. So this one is, it's not like you could read the whole thing and like that's all you need to know. It's going to give you your origins of like characters, but like they're all characters you mostly know for, like you got Superman and Batman are in there, but then you get some of those like side characters get a little bit more of a spotlight too. And I think the artwork in this one is super fun. Like I love it. It doesn't work with anything else, I don't think. Yeah. But maybe it does. But like I just love it in this.
Legendary Darwin Cook.
Yeah. I mean, I just can't imagine.
I think he wrote and drew that one. I remember.
Yeah,
he did some. They did I didn't love all the story, but he did some. It was a before Watchman, like a Watchman prequel story. He did the art, so that kind of fit that like retro style. I think that's where, as I was saying, it's more like retro looking.
Right. Yeah. It like fit the very good timepiece. Like I don't think he would like, I wouldn't see that as like him writing like a modern Batman story.
Right.
But like as like a more of a timepiece, set the tone back in the day.
Well, because it played a lot into like sort of retelling the like Silver Age of those characters, right? So it's set in the like 50s and 60s.
Which is a lot more fun for me.
Story.
Like if you go back and listen to our Marvel top 5, you hear that I'm not a big fan of old comics, so I get to read this newer version of those older, because I'm not going back and reading comics from the 50s. Sorry, folks.
Well,
but it's going to be rare. But
well, I think there's something to those, but I think for him it's clear, like, I grew up, I remember these stories, and like there's cool stuff there, but I always think that's cool when it's like set in like the period it was written, you know, like it basically is like, what if these characters were around then when they were coming out and not always retold in the modern context. Right. So yeah, and I remember liking that one.
To follow up the comic, you can go watch the animated movie, and it's also very good.
Yeah, that has one of my favorite, remember the Batman Martian Manhunter interactions, and those are great. So
that was good.
It's a solid pick. That's another good one. I like it. Okay, getting into the top 2. My number 2, Dakota, is going to have to be none other than the legendary Sandman Saga by Neil Gaiman, several other artists. I picked this one. It is set in the DC world. You do have some kind of cameos, acknowledgement. It's kind of a lot of its own thing, though. Sort of a dark, modern fantasy tale. If you've read Neil Gaiman's writing, you can kind of know what to expect. But he does just kind of introducing a whole nother world. You have the Endless, which are these kind of like beings that exist. Like if you have gods, they're like above gods, but they're characterized as people. It follows the main one, Morpheus, who's the Lord of Dreams, and kind of his quest. It goes in a lot of different places. It's very literary in a lot of ways. Sometimes like you'll have random like deep dive one-off issues, but I think it's really cool. And you get some like John Constantine and some other characters like that can show up in the more like darker mythology, magical world. 10 volumes, so it's a bit of a commitment, but I think it's one, it's one of my favorites of all time, I think, but definitely I think one of the best. And it's kind of crazy that DC put it out in like the 80s and let them do it so prominently. But I'm a big fan. I think the show first season has come out, and I think it did a pretty good job also, but I do highly recommend checking out the comics.
Okay.
And I think they still feel very fresh and relevant despite when they were made.
Nice. This probably hurts my street cred for this podcast, but that is a story I have never read.
Right.
But it does seem interesting. It's just it's another one of those that like I know in my heart I should read it, but it just seems too dark and scary for what I want to read right now. You know what I mean?
Right. Well,
like I'm reading a lot of Disney stuff right now, Jordan. I just finished Lilo and Stitch.
That's fair. It is pretty heavy in a lot of ways, okay. And it's a little dense in some ways. I don't necessarily think it's for everybody, to be honest. I think it's great, but I don't think you're like not a true comic person if you read Sandman or like, it doesn't quite grab me.
All right, fair. So, do you have, before we get into our number ones, do you have any runner-ups? I've kind of sprinkled mine in throughout. All right, what do you got?
I do. I mean, a definite one, I was trying to figure out how to fit it in, would be Kingdom Come by Mark Waid and Alex Ross. That is an awesome story. Again, another one for me that I read when I was younger that was kind of one of those like potential future, just taking the characters into a different context and seeing them age, because in comics, they don't age. They're usually just the same. So that one was really cool. I think they set up some awesome character dynamics and stuff. And then the art's just amazing. Oh, Alex Ross, can't go wrong.
I think that was the first time I'd ever seen Alex Ross art. And I was just like, why don't more people do art like this? This is incredible.
I know. It's almost like every panel you're like, I could frame that. It's just so cool. So
for sure.
And again, another one that uses like pretty much every major DC character, but reinterprets them also. So I love that one. Another one I read relatively recently is called Green Arrow, the Longbow Hunters. I wasn't too familiar with this. I found like a one issue and then I picked, it's like, it kind of published in prestige format. But I really like it because what it kind of does is it was kind of getting away from the like Green Arrow with like trick arrows and gadgets and stuff. Like he's literally kind of just a dude with a bow and arrow in this one. But it's a little more gritty because he's like on the trail of like a serial killer. And there's this other assassin that's killing people with arrows. And so it's kind of more like street level, grounded. And he even gets a new costume that's like, he's got the hood, and they kind of introduce some of that look, which I think was incorporated in other versions of Green Arrow. But I think it was a really cool story. I think it's definitely worth checking out that volume. And then the same writer, Mike Grell, did a run afterwards that's pretty well regarded. But I think it's a pretty cool take on the character.
Nice. No, I'll have to read that because that does sound cool. I remember him being cool in the cartoons, and like I've only read Green Arrow stories where he's like a part of the team, never where he's like the lead. So that sounds really cool. I like it. don't think I think I've kind of sprinkled in most of my, I think, I hate to say Batman stuff, but like I think Nightfall was another one that like I read. Those are pretty hefty volumes, and like read all the way through that. Similar art to my Robin, so I like that. It's got Azrael Batman. I think that's a cool character. And then I like the Court of Owls stuff from like New 52. Yeah. And then I liked that they kind of pulled like Talon as a character out of that. I think I would have liked him to be a little bit cooler, but it was a good story. And just it was more the concept of the Court of Owls that I really like, and their different Talon, because they would like resurrect old assassins, and then so it was like never ending cool characters. All right, number one, my number one all time. Typically, when I read my volumes, I almost never read all the way through, unless it's Long Halloween. Long Halloween is my all-time favorite DC book. It's definitely in my all-time comics. I don't think it's probably like top 3 for sure. I would have to really do some meditating on where it shakes out in the top 3. It might be number 1. Right. I love the story. I love the art. Kind of like you've said with like Hush. You get a lot of those characters in there in different ways that all make sense. But yeah, it's another one of those like, because I'm pretty particular about my art, and this is one that it was probably my first book that was like outside of my typical comic book art.
Tim Sale.
Right. I loved me some Tim Sale now. It's weird to say that he's probably one of my favorite all-time comic artists. And I don't think it wouldn't work for everything, because I don't want to only see that kind of art, but I love that it's in different things. Like even reading some of his Marvel stuff is cool. But Long Halloween and his whole Batman, excellent.
Yeah, that's another good one. That is a great story. And yeah, I agree. I think that's another one, though. It uses a lot of the Batman rogues gallery, but I think very effectively. Like you get enough with each of those characters. And then also very much feels like a detective story. For sure. I think a lot of the times when you lose the detective element of Batman, you miss out on a lot of what makes him cool. So, yeah, that's a good one.
And they pull in like characters that typically wouldn't matter. Like he does a lot more. Like although there's like Joker and Poison Ivy and those kind of characters that have powers, he's more so like investigating like the mob and kind of those like criminal underground type of things, not your super villain type of characters. So it was a cool mix, which I haven't really seen that type of mix in many other stories. So if you haven't read that one, you need to.
Definitely, I agree. Definitely not only a top Batman, but I think a top DC as well. Okay, my number one of all time DC story is, I think I can get away with this one, Dakota, but it's none other than Watchmen. And I think this one tops a lot of usually just best comic lists. And I've seen a lot of DC ones, because it was published by DC. It's, of course, its own world. No existing characters were in it, which I think is also what makes it really cool, because it's like your first exposure to these characters. And I do think Alan Moore does a great job. This is one that kind of put him on the map. But as far as like building this world, and then the Dave Gibbons art is also awesome, with a mystery to it, but really kind of kicking off what was kind of the modern deconstruction of the superhero, right? Kind of saying like, what do these characters really mean? Why are we so interested in them? And really, what would they look like in our real world? And like, you get some of that in some other comics at the time, whether it's like, Dark Knight Returns or, like some Frank Miller, Daredevil, that kind of stuff. But this one, I think, really did what a lot of superhero stories are doing today, which is like, let's really imagine if these were real characters and really break them down. But yeah, it's hard to beat it, in my opinion. I think I would put this in definitely one of the best ever. So if you haven't read it, I do think it's worth checking out. The movie,
I haven't read
What?
it.
Okay, well, it's
Another
worth
one.
checking out.
Another one of your top two.
I think this
read.
one's more accessible than Sandman.
Oh, for sure. I've checked it out from the library at least 5 times in my life, and I've read the first page several times, and for some reason, my brain just won't let me read the book. I've had it so many times.
It's definitely a comic that, like, as you read it, you are meant to, like, reread parts of it. I think that throws people off sometimes because, like, there are so many details and, like, the way it unfolds, and like I think it's great, man. I think the movie just kind of does like a shot for shot adaptation, which really doesn't capture the story. So if people have watched the movie, it's always hard for me to recommend the comic because, like, you kind of know a lot of what's going to happen, but it's just not as good. But if you haven't seen the movie,
I haven't.
Then
what am I doing?
Don't know what you're doing here. But yeah, I may sound like I'm going with the crowd by saying this is one of the greatest, but I think it's regarded as one of the greatest for a reason.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's definite personal favorite. So that is our lists of our top 5 DC comics, some of our favorites. You let us know what are some of your favorites. What are from our list might be ones that stand out to you. Please be sure to be liking, sharing, subscribing, and staying tuned for plenty more content. And until next time, stay strong.